I know it's been a while since I got up on the mic and started doing my thing. But ever since I started rapping, I've been getting mad fans, now my songs they play. But tell them haters playing no games with them. Put me up with the rap greats and I hang with them. Know some real killers in blue, I don't bang with them, but my soul known for good music, so I can sing for them. Listening to this, I can hear God rapping to me. It's different on stage and people clapping for me, cause I'm used to running the streets, I got people clapping for me. Nowadays, cops put our brothers in prison categories. And what's crazy, cause that ain't even the saddest story. They really killing us, we can't even tell our half the story. That's why I be in church, giving God the glory, trying to be a jar to his blessings, the devil door closing. I've been a lyrical miracle since they cut my umbilical. Still a fool with them syllables, guess you think something spiritual. I will cook up a batch of them bomb atomically chemicals, pick up a scoop and swing it at haters just like gorilla poop. Wait. The young man been 15 since 16. And it's crazy what I can do inside of a 16. A lot of people think that real music's be in the feelings. I got my squad, so if I'm hurt, prepare for lyrical healing.
I hate writing. I see too much of myself on this page, so when asked to write about me, I think, well, I'm a letter. There's a small part of a bigger picture, can you see it? To the right person, it makes perfect sense. From A to Z, these letters define me, a beautiful cosmic deity, erroneously fabricating, gathering his inner justifications, keenly learning, most notably of perspective, questions resting, silently tied up, viewing windows direct. Zooming in the background, I am a word often used in the wrong context. My whole, yet a single element in someone else's narrative. I alone define myself. I am a sentence. Subject, verb, and predicate. Do not subject my verbs with your prejudice. The things I'm subjected to made me do what I had to do. My verbs are always in agreement. I often find myself running on and on. Grammar never did fit real life. Structure, often faulty. But don't pretend that you don't understand just a little. I am a paragraph, built upon a foundation of sorts. Never really knew how to describe myself. Someone's intro, another's body, and someday, one day, someone's conclusion. But what am I concluding? I am an essay. And I change depending on who's reading me. Persuasive most of the time, trying to convince myself that I am worth the time. I'm worth being proofread, descriptive, painting a picture I've never seen, an image left behind in your mind when I leave that I'll never see. Expository, listen. This is what I am, and this is what I ain't. Narrative. I am a story. Will you read me?
Welcome, greetings, Hujambo to everyone. Welcome to day 3 of our conference, Pan-African Unity or Perish, a call for the abolition of neo-colonialism. This is our final day, and I want to appreciate everyone who has registered and has been able to stick around with us for these 3 days as we had these powerful speakers, powerful discussions that took place. This is a conference that was organized by the African Unity Movement for Decolonization. And just want to appreciate all of the member organizations for helping to make this conference happen. My name is Ikemba Ojore. I am a member of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, which is a member of the coalition, the African Unity Movement for Decolonization. The International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, or NPDUM for short, is an affiliate of the African People's Socialist Party. NPDUM is led up by President Columbayi Antoinette, so I want to acknowledge and appreciate the leadership of NPDUM, as well as the leadership of the Uhuru Movement, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. So, very excited to be here for the third day of this conference. And we have a bunch of great speakers that are going to be with us today, starting off with Gyude Moore. So I'm, very excited to hear what Gyude Moore has to bring us. But before that, just to give you the purpose of this conference and why we organized this Pan-African conference, we felt that it was necessary that we bring Pan-African organizations together to discuss these problems and how we can move forward to bring about the vision of our great ancestors, such as Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Martin Delany, Henry Sylvester Williams, who envisioned African people in the diaspora and on the continent working together at the time to abolish colonialism. And we're still following in their footsteps to abolish colonialism. And we have deepened our understanding of colonialism, of racism, what these things mean, and our understanding of capitalism. And I think like that is our deepening of the contradictions within the economic system is evidence of our evolution, because many of our great ancestors who brought forth the concept of Pan-Africanism really didn't have the understanding of the economic contradiction, the contradiction with capitalism as we have today. And so when we talk about Pan-Africanism, it isn't just about Africans coming together in a peaceful and unifying way without looking to overturn the system of colonial capitalism. When we speak of Pan-Africanism, we're talking about under scientific socialism, with the idea of abolishing, yes, neocolonialism, but also abolishing the economic system of capitalism. And so if Pan-Africanism isn't about organizing for the destruction of the international political economic system, then, for us, this isn't true Pan-Africanism. And so with that being said, we have a great speaker who's going to come to us this morning, and a plethora of speakers later on who's going to continue to deepen our understanding of Pan-Africanism, but also of neocolonialism and what must be done to destroy or disrupt this current political and economic structure. So with that being said, I want to introduce our speaker, Gyude Moore, who is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. He previously served as Liberia's Minister of Public Works from December 2014 to January 2018. Prior to that role, Moore served as Deputy Chief of Staff to President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and head of the President's Delivery Unit, PDU. At the Center for Global Development, or CGD for short. Mr. Moore's policy analysis and research focus are governance, the financing of infrastructure, and Africa's response to the changing landscape of external actors. His focus tracks the policies of traditional, aspiring, and emerging actors on the continent, especially the rise of China and its expanding role in Africa. Mr. Moore is a lecturer at the University of Chicago's Harris School for Public Policy, where he teaches a class on the role of infrastructure in the practice of foreign policy and international development. He serves on the board of advisors of the Master of Science in Foreign Service program at Georgetown University and on the board of directors of Management Sciences for Health and the Charter Cities Institute. So want everyone to welcome our first speaker, who's going to talk about a path of our own. That's the title of his presentation, Gyude Moore.
Thank you very much, Akemba, and thank you to everyone else, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I hope over the course of my remarks to make a contribution to the topics you've been discussing over the course of this conference. I want to thank Sis Hattie Carlis, who extended the invitation to me. We were just talking before we came on, and that we met about 20 or a little over 20 years ago in Liberia. I came to the U.S. for undergraduate and graduate school, and went back to work for the government of Liberia, and she was there. I was surprised to see her there, but she stayed, making a contribution to the country and to the continent writ large. And so it's a pleasure to reconnect with her and to be here this morning. I was just thinking about, a path of our own and how to shape my remarks here this morning. And I'm going to try, to weave disparate threads together in my comments. But and when I say our, I mean the 6 regions of Africa. So geographically, there are 5 regions, as you know: North, South, East, West, and Central Africa. But the African Union acknowledged what has always existed, that the 6th region of Africa is the diaspora. And the African diaspora is not simply people like me who left the continent voluntarily and moved to different places in the world. It is people of African descent everywhere in the world, from Black people in Iraq to Black people in Peru, in Mexico, everywhere where the descendants of people from Africa live, whether as minorities or majority in like as we have in the Caribbean. So when I say our over the course of my and speak of us over the course of my comments today, that's what I mean. It's the 6 regions of the continent. And to talk about our path going forward and talking about our collective future, we have to begin in our past. I know that in some quarters among Africans, there is this insistence that, we need to stop blaming slavery for everything. And there are people, non-Africans, who also try to tell us that, slavery was so long ago, we have to move on from that. But we're not going to be bullied into ignoring the deleterious effect of slavery on the current condition of the African person, regardless of where he is. I think next year, when you host your conference again, you should reach out to Howard French. Howard French used to be a correspondent for the New York Times. He's now a professor at Columbia University. He's recently written a book called Born into Blackness. It's a really, really good book, and having him at a conference like this would be useful. But I want to use some of Howard's research to begin by centering us in the past so that we can be able to determine the path forward. Howard notes that when the transatlantic slave trade begins, the total population of people living in Africa is about 100 million. Now, as you know, every population everywhere in the world is broken up into at least three cohorts. You have children, you have working age, and you have the elderly. So let's try to be as conservative as possible. That at the beginning of the slave trade, we're talking about the entire African continent having about 100 million people. Let's say 15% of that population were children, and maybe 10% were the elderly. These are just rough figures so that we can be able to have a conversation. It means, you know, even if, 10% are children and 10% are the elderly, somewhere between 20 to 25% of the population was not a target of people looking for slaves. So we're talking about 75 to 80 million people who were being targeted as slaves. The total number of Africans brought to these shores in the New World is estimated to be around 12 million. But it is also estimated that somewhere between 5 to 40% of them died in the trek from inland to the shore and waiting for the slave ships. And then another 10% of them died in the passage from Africa to the New World. I want you to take these numbers under the consideration that only about 100 million people were on the continent at the time. Somewhere between 20 to 25% of them were children and the elderly and therefore not targeted. And certain regions of the continent were targeted more than others. So that number of 12 million brought into the New World, 5 to 40% who perished before getting to the shores, and another 10% that died, is not coming from 100 million. It's coming from somewhere between 75 to 80 million. The effects of that continue to reverberate today. There is no way we can talk about the current position, the current economic position of the African person, regardless of where he is, without taking that into consideration. And you have to understand that the ledger of slavery meant that a subtraction from here was equivalent to an addition here. That while Africa was depleted of its vital human resources, that human resources was significant, was crucial to the process of capital formation in the West. The United States isn't what it is today without African labor. And so being a person from a country that is still struggling with the process of capital formation, I cannot overemphasize how important that labor, cheap, free labor was. And that capital formation is what drove modernity in the forms that we see it today. So I think it is important for us to understand that we're not just coming from a baseline of zero. We're coming from a sub-zero baseline, right? And people say to us, well, Africa wasn't the only place that was colonized. There's colonization in Latin America. There's colonization in Asia. Yes, there was. But there wasn't a systematic effort to take the most productive and the most energetic people from those places for decades. And this isn't some comparison like, oh, who was exploited the most. This is to establish a past, to establish the contours of our past if we were to determine the future. But having said all of that, I think it is important for us as the people of Africa's 6 regions, it is important to us that we recognize this past, but that we are not defined by this past. Because this past means to keep us subservient. This past means to keep us as the poorest people in the world, that the continent itself remains sort of the ward of the international system. At some point, we have to determine, not anyone else, no one is coming to save us. We're going to do this ourselves. We have to determine that in spite of this past, we're going to overcome this because we're capable of overcoming this. Why is this important? So I ended up doing a significant amount of infrastructure work, but my core training is in international affairs and foreign policy. And what drives foreign policy is interests. There is no external actor in Africa today who is present on the continent out of altruism, that they're there because they just love the African people and want to do good by them. Every external actor on the continent today is in Africa in pursuit of their interests. Every external actor on the continent today is in Africa pursuing what is best for them. And as much as it is possible, some of these actors will act in a way that is mutually beneficial, win-win. But I like to remind African audiences that if the interest of an external actor collides with the interest of Africa, every external actor will pick their interest above ours. And at some point, it is important for us to enter into every negotiation thinking this way, understanding this way, that no one is going to advocate for you better than you can advocate for yourself. So when I think of our path forward, I like to think of the last at least 20 years of history in Africa. And I like to begin in the 90s. For most of us who are old enough to remember, in 1989, when the Cold War ended, Africa no longer provided any strategic benefit to anyone because there was no global struggle. The West simply up and left. Russia, the USSR, was completely destroyed. And without patrons to support them, a lot of African dictators were either overthrown or civil wars began to overthrow them. And so if you remember the 90s, the entire continent was on fire. It was during the 90s, 1989, the Liberian Civil War started, but it was during the 90s that the Sierra Leonean Civil War occurred. It was during the 90s that the Rwandan genocide occurred. It was during the 90s, the Black Hawk Down event in Somalia. All across Africa, there were wars as, differences that had been papered over by support from patrons during the Cold War was suddenly torn apart. And because of those wars, there were significant events of tragedy across the continent, from famines to huge humanitarian crises and refugees and internally displaced persons. And when I tell this story, I always talk about myself. I finished high school in a refugee camp in Cote d'Ivoire during this era. And at this point, most of the West simply looked at Africa in the way they've always looked at Africa, as a source of raw materials. And their interest in Africa actually declined even further. So when the West looked at Africa, it was either a source of raw material or through the lenses of humanitarian assistance. And so a significant ramp up humanitarian assistance to Africa, but Africa wasn't really seen as a place to do business or people to be treated as equals. And that changed in the year 2000 when, just a year after, in 2001, China would become a member of the WTO. But by 2000, China had become the factory of the world. And if you go to a factory floor, what do you need? You need feedstock to feed into the machines to produce a finished product. And because Africa is so richly endowed in natural resources, it made sense for the Chinese to come to Africa. And China sort of felt this niche. At the point in 2000, the Chinese companies were not as good as their European counterparts, but they were better than the African ones. And so they fit this niche. And because they came into Africa with resources from Chinese policy banks and did not interfere in the internal politics of African countries, but also, were quicker in the decision making and faster in the execution of projects, most African economists and African governments embraced the Chinese. And in my work here, one of the first things that I say to Western audiences is that, whether it's Americans or Europeans, but mainly Americans, who think like, why do the Africans embrace the Chinese? Why aren't the Africans alarmed about the growing influence of China in Africa? This is a new form of colonialism. And I say to them that the entire last 500 years of our history has simply been the history of non-African actors coming to the continent. So the Chinese are simply the most recent arrival, but you've been here. We have had a relationship with Europe for over 500 years. And I promise you that if the Europeans had acted in the same way the Chinese are acting today, there wouldn't have been any space for the Chinese when they finally arrived. About a week ago, the UN Agency for Trade, UNCTAD, released a report that noted that 46 out of Africa's 54 economies depend for up to 60% of their revenue on unprocessed raw materials as exports. Terms of trade. What do we sell to the rest of the world? What does the rest of the world give to us, sell to us? Since the independence era, the basket of African exports have always been raw materials. There is a graphic that is now being shared, and that graphic shows the contribution of different regions of the world in terms of industrialization and manufacturing. Africa's contribution is 2%. Africa's contribution is 2%. That number hasn't changed drastically since the 1970s. As a matter of fact, it's actually declined. Oceania, where we have New Zealand, we have the Pacific Islands, they comprise 0.54% of the global population. They're not even 1% of the world's population. Their contribution to global trade and global manufacturing is 1%. Africa is about 17% of the global population, and our contribution is 2%. That is a scandal. And the terms of trade have remained like that. Every single trade partner with Africa has been content with taking natural resources out of Africa, processing them elsewhere, and bringing finished products to Africa. So increasingly, what we get from trade is significantly less than what we have to give. And ultimately, we're living beyond our means because we're incapable of financing the way we live from the trade we do. How do we chart a path forward that allows Africa to represent its true place in the world, not simply in terms of its population, but in terms of its output? We're at a place now in our history where some of the most miraculous things we've ever seen is happening with the population of the continent. Around 1914 to 1920, at the beginning of World War I, Africa was about 7% of global population. Today, Africa is about 17% of global population. By mid-century, 1 out of every 4 human beings will be African. It is the fastest growth in human population we've ever seen. The very identity of humanity is African. But let's go a little bit into these numbers. When I have this conversation, I like to talk about median age so that we separate. It's a cutoff point, half above, half below, and not average age. The only 3 European countries have a median age of less than 40. And the small countries like Luxembourg, like Cyprus, and the biggest of them is Ireland, where the median age is around 38. The oldest European country is probably Italy with 47. Germany is like 46.7, and Portugal is 46.8. That's the median age. Half of the population is 45 years or older in Europe. In the United States, it's 8 years over the global median. 39 is the median age in the United States. China, because of the one-child policy, the median age in China is also 38. So China is one of those countries that's going to become significantly old before it becomes wealthy. So let's look at those numbers again. In Japan, which has the oldest in the world, the median age is 48. In the United States, it's 39. In Latin America, it's 31. In India, which is the second youngest country in the world, is 28. In Africa, it's somewhere between 18 and 19, which means that, for example, Nigeria, most of the people in Nigeria today, about half of the people in Nigeria today, will be alive in the 2080s. You can't say the same about Japan. What does this mean about the future of the global economy? As we note, the global economy today runs on consumption. And the consumption patterns of old people is completely different from the consumption pattern of young people. And so we're going to see significant decline in the economic power of the West. But that's not the only problem. At some point, someone has to fill every job. I mean, we can use machines, but we're still going to need people. And by 2035, the number of working age people in Africa is going to be larger than the number of working age people in the rest of the world combined. As I noted, the very identity of humanity going forward is African. The only source of labor that will be available to the global economy will be African. And the only place where consumption patterns will be strong enough to drive global economic growth will be Africa. All of these are wonderful, but none of this stuff happens by chance. It will not come to pass by happenstance, because those numbers that could drive global consumption, those numbers that could provide global labor, if we do not find a way to channel them productively, those numbers themselves will be a source of instability on the African continent. So, what is my recommendation going forward? One is, and in this conversation with Heidi before, I was saying how in the independence era, 1957, 1960s, when communications were expensive, when travel was expensive, Black people remain closer together than today when communication is cheaper, when travel is cheaper. Black people everywhere in the 1960s, in the independence era, understood that their rise and prosperity would have to be collective or it would not happen at all. They understood that over the course of their lives, they will be subjected to certain indignities that were traceable to the single fact that they were Black. And so they understood Black people in the Americas, Black people in the United States understood that the movement for independence that was happening in Africa affected them too. Black people in Africa understood that the civil rights movement, the movement for equality here in this country affected them too. Because how we're seen in the eyes of the rest is going to be shaped by how every one of us are seen in the eyes of them. And so one of the things that baffles me is how little of American capital in the hands of American Blacks finds its way into Africa. Those numbers that I spoke about, because of how the high total fertility rate in Africa, in Nigeria is somewhere around 5.2, right? Because of that, Africa's savings are non-existent. And it makes intuitive sense. If you have a single kid or you have two kids, it is possible for you, even if you don't do like a high-paying job, you can still have savings, especially if it's a two-parent home. But if you have 3 kids, if you have 4 kids, if you have 5 kids, there's absolutely no savings. If it's just after you're done, taking care of one kid, there's another kid, and because of that, Africa's low savings rate has meant that Africa has to look externally for capital. And most times, before the arrival of the Chinese, we look toward the West for financing. And now with the arrival of the Chinese, we're looking toward the Chinese to do that. In East Africa, they're looking toward the Gulf states to do that. And for some reason, Black people outside of Africa do not constitute any form of capital that can be deployed on the continent. And consequently, the continent itself has to depend on non-Black people to finance its needs. I think that's one of the things that we ought to change. Because a Black businessman in the United States, a Black businessman in Europe, has access to capital that is significantly cheaper than a businessman in Africa would. And here's what happens. For the last, 10 years, since the global financial crisis, we've had low interest rates across the developed world. What happens when you have low interest rates? When you have low interest rates, it means that the cost of borrowing is cheap. And when the cost of borrowing is cheap, then the cost of failure is cheap. And when the cost of failure is cheap, then people take risks. So Obviously, sometimes people abuse it and we have a misallocation of resources. But it means that because the cost of capital has been cheap here, that's why we've seen all of the crazy stuff we've seen. People investing in NFTs, people investing in all kinds of weird coins because the cost of capital is so cheap. Where in Africa, what we're trying to build physical infrastructure, trying to build companies, the cost of capital is so high. How is it then that Black people, and I'm not just talking Africans, Black people who have access to cheap capital, for some reason have not found a way to channel that cheap capital into Africa where the cost of capital is so high to be able to build? And because the cost of capital is so high, the returns to capital in Africa are pretty high. We need to do something about that so that all of this capital that we're seeing in the West, as I noted from the beginning, the entire process of capital formation in the West would not have occurred without African input. That capital needs to find a way back into Africa so that we can be able to build infrastructure. And the way we do that are people who care enough about the continent and want to see the continent move forward, and that's Black people. The second thing is, at some point, we're going to have to stop making these distinctions among ourselves. There is now a group of there are Americans who call themselves FBA, Foundational Black Americans. Some of them call themselves DOS, the descendants of slaves, and they do that to be able to make a distinction between themselves and people who came from the Caribbean and people who came from Africa. As long as we continue to find reasons to differentiate among ourselves, to incite strife among ourselves so that, oh, he's that kind of Black, he's this kind of Black, we're not going to focus on the things that matter to us, because in the end, as I said, our prosperity is always going to be collective. We're not going to succeed as individuals being prosperous. We have to do it collectively. And I always like to pose this question, if we have foundational Black Americans and we have descendants of slaves and then we have people from the Caribbean, people from Africa, how do you explain me? My name is William Gyude Moore. I just introduced myself as Gyude Moore because, William Moore, when I first arrived in the US for school and I introduced myself, this is a guy from Africa, and I introduced myself as William Moore, people weirded out, like, how could you be from Africa and your name be William Moore? And I tell them, I'm from Maryland County in Africa. Maryland County in Africa, in Liberia, used to be a country by itself. It was called Maryland in Africa. It was founded by free slaves from Maryland here in the United States. It only joined Liberia in 1857, right? It was a whole country by itself. And that's why, of course, I would end up with a name like William Moore, but I am Liberian. In fact, I'm not just Liberian, I'm indigenous Liberian because I belong to the Gribble ethnic group. How do you explain that? If we find all of these times to be able to make these distinctions among ourselves, we are distracted from the things that we should be focused on. The things we should be focused on is our collective prosperity. The final thing that I would say is that the wealth of the global capitalism that has brought us up to this point has been on the back of fossil fuels. And now, because of the impact of fossil fuels on the economy, on the global, on the climate, there is now a transition away from fossil fuels. That transition is toward a non-carbon based economy, and that is driven mainly by renewables. But the metals that drive renewables, from the copper that carries the power, from the lithium that powers the batteries, and the cobalt that powers the batteries, those minerals are abundantly available in Africa. We have an opportunity once again to be able to transform the economic condition of the average African, regardless of where he lives. And the way we do that is that we cannot continue to repeat the patterns of trade of the past, where everyone comes to Africa, collects the raw materials, and take it elsewhere to process it, because every single time we do that, we support wealth creation, we support jobs in other countries. And that is now the responsibility of leadership in Africa to ensure that this time around, I always say that, we have seen 4 commodity super cycles, commodities like, metals, like minerals. And the first commodity super cycle was the one we saw when the United States became industrialized. The second commodity super cycle we saw was in the build-up to World War II. The third commodity super cycle that we saw And a super cycle is when the price of a commodity is trading higher than its average price. And the third commodity super cycle was when the rebuilding after World War II. So when the US industrialized in the build up to World War II, the rebuilding after World War II. The fourth commodity super cycle was driven by Chinese industrialization, right? There is a possibility of a fifth commodity super cycle in this transition to net zero. And there is only one place left in the world where the built environment is undeveloped enough that it could drive a commodity super cycle even without the transition to net zero. And that space is Africa. I believe that if we do not take advantage of this, all of the benefits that are listed before, that could actually drive the economic condition of the African person, regardless of where he lives in the world. If we do not take advantage of that now, it is possible that 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, our children will gather here again discussing these same things. And it would be a shame. Thank you for having me. And I'd like to end there.
All right. Thank you for that presentation. You touched on so many great points. I want to open up the chat for any questions that people may have for Brother Gyude Moore, Brother William Gyude Moore. I hear that, but this is an opportunity for anybody who has any questions to ask those. I do have a few questions of my own, but I definitely want to give people an opportunity in the chat to ask their questions. And with that being said, too, in regards to your presentation, like I said, you touched on so many points. The future of Africa, in regards to population, in comparison to what's happening in other places around the world, and with this population growth, Africa definitely, I think, is important that Africa, like right now, get a hold of their economy, so we can sort of forge our own path and prepare for this population growth. Because what's happening with the current relationship that we have with foreign, powers, what's happening is that, that working, because when I look at that population growth, I'm looking at a large, working class. Is this huge working class for the future going to be dependent on foreigners, or those outside the continent, or are we going to be in control of our own political and economic destiny? And so I think like that's the the question right now, and that's why we're organizing the way that we are organizing, so that we can make sure that our posterity is no longer dependent on outside forces. So the title of your presentation made me think of Jalil Muta King's book, We Are Our Own Liberators. And it talks about whatever we do. Well, at least I know in your presentation, you're talking about whatever we do, it has to benefit African people. We can't put, other groups before Africa or Africans. And this is, I'm seeing this a lot now, though. I'm seeing, a lot of African leaders aligning themselves with the former colonial powers. So, or current colonial powers, I should say. This is why we're dealing with neocolonialism. So let me get to my question. So do you think that we'll be able to forge a path on our own under the current political and economic structure in Africa, not even talking about in the world, but under our structure with the colonial identities that we have? Because you talked about the divisions around the world. How much does that have to do with the colonial identities, like Nigeria, like Nigerian, or even African American, or Jamaican, or Cameroonian, like these different colonial identities? Are we going to be able to unify under these colonial identities, or do we have to like create a new you get what I'm saying, structure in order for us to work together. Because I feel like sometimes like nationalism, is getting in the way of our seeing our general interests.
Yeah.
Rather, you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. Let me see. Yeah, I definitely do. And look, for the first time in a long time, I'm really hopeful. In the early '90s, there was a meeting in Lagos about this idea that how we should create a single market. Instead of having 54 separate economies, let's create a single market in 1992, and nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened. And then in 2018, under the leadership of Paul Kagame, we brought the Africa Continental Free Trade Area into being. That is supposed to suspend tariffs on over 90% of goods and services. And we have seen that thing move at the speed that we have not seen any continental effort move before in Africa. So I honestly believe that African leaders, regardless of what one might think about them, have come to appreciate the difficulty of Africa's position in the world. That when it comes to negotiations, we have no leverage because we're weak, and that 30% of Africa's population lives in landlocked countries. We makes it really, really difficult for them. So our best possible means of being able to create our outcomes as we engage the rest of the world is that we have to do it as a unit. So I think the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is an important piece of that work, and that I'm not saying that it completely gets rid of national identity, but it changes. Hang on, I'm sure. So wait, here we go. That's my Liberian passport, but it doesn't say Liberia on it. Like, it says Liberia here, but here it says the Economic Community of West African States. So for these 15 countries, we have the same passport. We can travel from one country to another and stay up to 90 days without requiring a visa. Does it always work? Not really, but that itself was unimaginable, say 20 years ago, but that's where we are. And there is a push toward a common African passport that will allow us to do this across the continent. We have the same thing in the East Africa region. Recently, the Democratic Republic of Congo became a member of the East African community. So you see African economies forging closer ties and attempting to create a single unit out of disparate ones. And that, for me, is a source of encouragement that our national identities, our colonial past notwithstanding, most Africans understand this, as I noted again and again, that our prosperity will always come in the collective, not as individuals. It's not as Jamaicans or people or Guyanese. It's not as Americans, Black Americans, or Nigerians. It's going to be of people of African descent. And that's why I began my talk by saying the 6 regions of Africa.
Yeah, appreciate that. And just so that you know, the motivation behind the question I asked had to do like a personal transformation that I even had to make here in the United States, where I had to tell myself, I'm not American. I'm African. Like, even the term, African American, I think is a contradiction in terms. But you mentioned ADOS earlier, and I promised the viewers I'm gonna get to your questions right now. But one of the things that I think African Americans have an issue with, or Black Americans have an issue with, is that they're still identifying themselves with the colonizer and still holding those, or the former slave masters, and still holding those values. So, in a broad sense, I'm looking at that on the continent as well, as far as like continuing to hold on to colonial identities. It's sort of like an acceptance of the current political and economic, system, and not really looking for a revolution, which I think is necessary, like the overturning of the system that has historically oppressed and exploited us. As long as you continue to, hold the same values and identify with the political identities that has been, forced upon you. I don't know. It's sort of like this legitimization and acceptance. So for me, it was like a breaking away, and I think that's the identity crisis that exists in many of the colonial areas. With that being said, let me get to these questions because I know I can go. But there's a question where someone's asking, how is the looming food crisis going to collide with the population boom?
We have this. We have this. There's a statistic that is repeated again and again, that 60% of what is left of arable land in the world is in Africa. But just forget that. There was a report done by McKinsey in 2019 that showed that without even expanding the amount of land under cultivation today, no expansion in the land under cultivation today, simply efficiently and effectively using the current land we have, Africa could produce up to 20% of global grains and cereals. So it comes back to this very thing that, we import almost all of what we eat. And there is a possibility for Africa to feed itself if we can direct the resources and the investment in that. So yeah, if we do not address that question, then the growth in population is definitely going to be affected by that. But if we were to address that question, that's not even a problem. That's not even a question for us to talk about. And this is one of the few silver linings of the global economic crisis and the Ukraine grain crisis. But because of the price increase in the price of wheat, in a lot of African countries, they began to turn to local staples. In Cote d'Ivoire, they were actually making flour out of cassava. And it's always been possible to make flour out of cassava. In fact, when you go today to Whole Foods and order cassava flour, which can be changed on a one-to-one basis with wheat flour, it is more expensive because it's gluten-free. But for a long time, we were content with importing wheat flour. So I think the food crisis would be a problem today, not even with the population coming, if we do not invest in African agriculture so that it's more productive.
Thank you for that. There's another question. What is your evaluation of prospects for success of African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
Yeah, this is, this, and I said, for me, first is a source of hope. The pace at which it's gone, the speed at which it's gone, it's very encouraging. I think people need to be realistic about how quickly it will happen. I want you to look, the most successful integration of economies into one will be the European Union. And even up to today, the European Union still has its issues, all right? So this idea that we will be able to do it quicker and faster than the Europeans did, I don't think that's realistic. But I am very, very optimistic that it's going to happen. I think if there's anything that this pandemic has shown us, if there's anything this supply chain crisis has shown us, it's shown us that, as Africans, no one is looking out for us. And unless we begin to look out for ourselves, we're always going to be on the back end of global crises. So I'm pretty hopeful that this time around, we're going to do it right.
All right. Another question is, what type of financial vehicles would bring the most potential for collective economic development that Black Americans could invest in? Thinking long term, what do you think about Pan-African baby bonds? It's the first time I'm hearing about baby bonds. So, yeah.
Well, I think any kind of diaspora bonds that make capital cheaper than the cost at which African governments or African businesses can achieve them now would be good. So a Pan-African baby bond, a Pan-African bond, a diaspora bond, anything that, investment is sort of like borrowing from our future to finance our past so that we can catch up to that future, right? I mean, investment is basically the price we pay for change. So there's that. I think I'll just give you an example. Most people ask me, because I've been in government, and then people who see it from the outside think like, how is it possible that Africa can have these gold mines and iron ore mines and uranium mines, and for some reason you're like still poor? How is that possible? Well, I can give you like a quick view of how that happens. Take an iron ore mine, take a mountain that has iron ore in it. the cost of extraction of that ore, the expertise of extracting that ore is very specialized and very expensive. So most African countries do not have the means in terms of money, people, and machines to be able to extract that ore. So normally, what would an African country in that position do? You would turn to a company to a mining company like Glencore, to a mining company like a Chinese mining company, and sign an agreement. That agreement usually is called a mineral development agreement. The agreement says you're going to extract this, you're going to pay this amount of royalty, and the company that we create to extract this, the government will have a small share in it, anywhere from 5% to 15%. So even though the mountain is in Africa, even though the ore is in Africa, the company that is now extracting that ore in exchange for expertise, in exchange for financing, our total equity in that will be somewhere between 5 to 15%. There was a report out in 2019 that showed $1 trillion worth of African minerals, with the rights to $1 trillion worth of African minerals were held by firms that were either listed on the London Stock Exchange or domiciled in UK jurisdictions. So the minerals are in Africa, $1 trillion worth of minerals, but access to rights to extract them were held by firms from the UK. That's how the system is. If we could find a way where African governments looking to extract their ore, African governments looking to process their ore, could have access to capital that was not tied to Western capital and Western firms, that would increase the amount of stake Africans would have in that. But as long as that's the financing mechanism that remains, then it's not just the Europeans, because when the Europeans leave, the Chinese come, they're going to repeat the exact same thing. So at some point, for Africans or African Americans or Black people living outside, the question has to be, how can we create pools of capital that make it possible for Africans to benefit directly from the resources that is extracted from their country? Currently, the model that we have doesn't really work. For us, at least. It works for other people. I mean, that's why they're rich, but it doesn't work for us.
Yeah, I mean, in your presentation, you really touched on the current social system, its existence being born out of the the labor of African people, the enslavement of African people, the theft of land, and and so forth. And I think when we're talking about this current social system that we're a part of, and this is why I have a sort of like this. I have this concern in regards to our participation in the system and trying to figure out the system and best to get around the system and enrich ourselves without having in the back of our mind the mindset of like, how are we going to destroy the system? And I don't know if that's your thinking, but like I feel like, yeah, go ahead.
Here's how I see it, right? In a way, when after segregation was abolished, a lot of Black institutions, vibrant Black institutions, simply failed. They couldn't survive anymore, because I take historical Black colleges and universities. Some of them have struggled after segregation, because once it became possible for Black students to be accepted into any university in the world or any university in the US, then they made that choice to go to these universities. And the way I see it is that we were caught in this bind, because if you're a Black person here in America, if you're living in a country whose wealth was based on the wealth of the uncompensated labor of your ancestors, right? Not simply the ones who worked here as slaves, but the one who didn't make it, the one who died on their way here, then there is a certain sense of entitlement to whatever benefits the system has. A white person whose family came from Europe 20 years ago, cannot have more access and more rights to the benefits of the American system than a Black person whose ancestors built it. And so the question then is, should we be working for this entire thing to collapse? Or should we be taking as much out of this to create for ourselves that which we're due? So I don't know. I think, and that's a beautiful thing, because as Black people, we're not a monolithic group. There will always be different strands of thoughts among Black people, and I'm all for that. As long as the ultimate outcome is our collective prosperity, then the path that we use to get there might differ. But if the outcome is the same, if we're on the same page in terms of what we're seeking, I'm okay with that, right? And so I think there are Black people who are going to choose to remain within the system and extract as much as possible as they can from the system, and more power to them. And then there are Black people who are going to think that the system as it exists does not work for them and choose to work outside of the system, and more power to them, as long as the ultimate outcome for both groups is our collective prosperity.
Yeah, I agree with that. The only issue I have with is in regards to the practices, though, with in the system. So even with what you're saying, like I agree in regards to, I mean, we're a part of, everybody's a part of this system. You know, whatever you think, like my mindset, I know that when I go to work, you know, I'm engaged in the practices of capitalism. But when I get off work, I'm working to, you know, to destroy that very system that right now is feeding me, right? But I think like it's a particular mindset, and then the development of practices that, let me put it this way, because the practices itself, like I said, I go to work and I'm engaged in the system. Those practices itself is helping fuel the oppression and exploitation, I think, of African people. Like within the system, let me ask you this, like within our social system, we know from its very inception there had to be an underclass. Do you think that we can continue to practice this, I'm gonna say capitalism, because this is what we practice capitalism without there being a underclass? So even like if Africans are engaged in the system to for prosperity and to build wealth among ourselves, like, can we do that without there being an African underclass or some other underclass?
Yeah, well, that's a struggle, right? I mean, the system. Look, if you bought a boat, like a yacht, someone has to clean it, bro. Right? If we build big cities and great cities, you know, someone's going to be working in janitorial services to keep the city functioning. I think the problem is that, do people get compensated based on their contribution to society? We found out who essential workers were during the crisis, right? During the COVID-19 pandemic. But those were the people who were paid the least before. And for some reason, society didn't value them. So I think the system can be made to work for the people like it does in Scandinavia, you know, for them. I mean, yeah, there are working class people there, but the society provides enough for them to have a stake in the system. I think that's the problem here. And the second thing that I would say is, like, as we think about the system, is look at China. You know, they call it communism with Chinese characteristics. That's how they define what they're doing. Can we have capitalism or socialism with African characteristics? Because one of the best ways to generate resources is to provide something of value and get compensated in return for that. But in compensating you in return for what you've created of value, we're going to extract a tax, because we understand not every single person in society is going to be fortunate enough to do that. And those who are unfortunate, that tax is going to help to make their life equal, or at least close to the lives of those who are doing it. That's what socialism does, right? At least in practice, that's what it's supposed to do. So for me, I think one of the things that we need to begin with first is, at least in Africa, is to increase the amount of trade that happens within Africa and between African countries. In Asia, it's up to 67, 70%. Here in Africa, it's 17%, and it's been 17% for a while. We need to increase the volume and diversity of trade that is occurring between and with and among African countries. Why? Because every single time I order something from an African country, I am supporting a Black business. I am supporting the wealth creation in Africa, right? So if I'm in Liberia and I'm ordering onions from Kenya, and I'm ordering, you know, fufu from Ghana, and I'm ordering all of the productive capacity that goes into that to eventually, and I pay for that, It is a Ghanaian, it is a Kenyan entrepreneur who is getting it. But when I bring the rice in from Vietnam, it's a Vietnamese farmer, it's a Vietnamese miller, and it's maybe a Greek ship owner who's bringing that. There is very little participation for Africa in the value chains that exist as they are today. And because of that, that's what I meant by the terms of trade. Every time we engage in trade with external actors, what we get out of trade is increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And yet, the foundational, the basic building blocks of the products that they're making that's making them so wealthy comes from us. At some point, something's got to give. This is unsustainable in the long run. And so I think, at this point, if we were to say, look, let's step away from the capitalist system and walk away from good, I feel like that I can't agree with that. And the reason is the capitalist system would not exist without our labor, and that labor was uncompensated. The capitalist system would not exist without our minerals, and that minerals were not equally, not compensated. They owe us. This system owes us. And because this system is not going to voluntarily give it to us, we have to devise ways to extract from this system what is owed to us that contributes to our collective prosperity. So I think, and I'll end my comment here with that. When God spoke to, I'm sorry for those who aren't Christians, but I'm Christian, and that's my center and mooring. And in the Bible, when God spoke to Abraham and told him that your descendants will be held as slaves for 400 years, he didn't just tell him that. He told him that when they left slavery, they would leave with great substance. He promised them that the people who will enslave your people, your descendants, when they let them go, they will leave with great substance. That supernatural wealth transfer was God ordained. So when Israel left Egypt, they left with Egypt's wealth. And even after slavery ended, even after colonialism ended, that's the last piece that we're waiting for. There has not been that transfer of wealth from those who have exploited us to those who've been exploited. And because they're not going to, we know what Frederick Douglass said about power, that power concedes nothing without a demand. We have to make a demand. We have to find a way to transfer that wealth that is due us, that is owed us. That is a biblical principle for people who've been oppressed. So, walking away from the system, destroying the system, I feel like that's me destroying my work. I need to extract from that what the old for us.
I hear that. There's another question I have here. One of the biggest obstacles we have is traders on the continent.
Yeah.
Those who will kill for the Western powers. Look at what happened to Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara. How can we combat that?
So, if we're Black people, if we're honest with ourselves, the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that we're not unique. Every group of people have traitors and haters, right? Every group of people have a small cadre of people who are willing to sacrifice the collective in favor of the personal. So that's going to happen. We talk about the transatlantic slave trade, but there were Black people who helped raid other Black people to capture them as slaves. We're not going to sit here and pretend like, there wasn't participation from Black chiefs. I am from, so among my ethnic group, the Gribbles, there's a story told. So I don't know how much people know about this, but the Liberian government in 1916 or 1917 was investigated by the League of Nations because the Liberian government was engaged in slavery and trafficking. This is a country that was founded by former slaves that were themselves sending their countrymen to what was called Spanish Guinea, Fernando Po, which has now become Equatorial Guinea. They were sending them there as indentured servants and slaves. Supposedly among our people, one of the people who was arranging this had a chance to go to Spanish Guinea This is oral history. It's not written anywhere. I went back with my father to our village, and it was told to me that when they returned, he came back and said, it is not right for us to continue to send our people over there because the conditions under which they live there. If they want to buy cows and goats and stuff, that's fine. We can send it to them, but let's not continue to send our people there. I'm just telling the story of Liberia's investigation by the League of Nations of our people doing that to say that there has always been an element among us who will work against our progress. Always. And as long as there is someone who's willing to pay them, people would. I think one of the ways that we get rid of this is what we teach our children about themselves. So I'm here in this country. I have 2 kids who are Americans, and I was very adamant when my daughter was born, from age 5, taking my daughter to Liberia every year, sometimes 2 times a year. Why? Because for me, it was important for my daughter, who lives in a majority white country, to go to a country where everyone in authority is Black. When you turn on the television, the people you're seeing, the newscasters are Black. The cool people in the country who everyone wants to be like, they're Black. For her to see Black people in authority and see herself in them, because she lives in a country that doesn't put Black people in that position, so that it affects her sense of self and a sense of worth and identity. How do we prevent people from being traitors of their kind, of their own? We're never going to completely get rid of evil. But the things we teach our children about ourselves, where we come from, who we are, how we got here. It's like that thing from the Bible, how we train up a child in a way that they should go. And so I think that's one of the ways we do that. We start early. The second thing is that we hold each other accountable. There is not a single trader who does it on his own. And as long as there aren't people who are going to hold them accountable, they're going to continue to do that. So I like to think, when I took sociology, that part of the reason why people have negative images of minority groups is simply because people tend to take the most negative thing of the minority and apply it to the general. But for the majority group, they're treated as individuals. And so I think there are way more people who want to do good than people who want to be traitors. But because we are used to taking the one negative stuff and sort of extrapolating it and making it seem as if it is the dominant trait. So we're not going to completely get rid of that, but we can do much in accountability in how we bring up our children to be able to limit the damage that they can do as we try to build a path forward.
All right, thank you. I think there's a couple of more questions. I'm spending my weekend reading Environmental Activism, Vanessa Nakate. Are ECOWAS and the AU, I hope I'm reading this right, are ECOWAS and the AU preparing for the climate catastrophe? Pan-Africanism seems inevitable if food and water will continue to be scarce, but I'm assuming our governments want to prevent that. You get that question?
Yeah, I understand. I understand what she's saying. Okay. And I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. So you have to say you have to sort of, when you hear me speak today, and then you go back to 10 years ago and have maybe videos of me speaking as a minister, you would notice a very clear difference. Well, there's some things that have remained the same. When you are in government, the stakes are higher, the stakes are different. So most people who are in government, what are politicians most concerned about? Bro, holding on to power. Politicians, when you win the first election, as soon as you come into the office, you start to think of running for a second term. Right? That's what they're thinking about. And the exigencies of politics sometimes get in the way of long-term thinking and planning. And we see that happen a lot on the continent, where people are so obsessed with the day-to-day politics that they're not paying attention to what is happening long-term. So I think, the picture there is mixed. I think we have seen last year and much of this year, we saw the first climate-induced famine in Madagascar. Right now, 20 million people are at risk of severe malnutrition across northern Kenya. parts of Somalia and Ethiopia because the crops have failed for 4 years straight, and there's now projections that this is going to be fifth year when the rains will not come. We saw last year massive locust infestation. So the effects of a changing climate are already felt everywhere, on the continent. How much African governments are paying attention to this? I think the picture there is mixed. But I agree with you that it is something that we have to pay attention to. It's kind of linked to the question below, the question above about the food crisis. So I think most people in government want to change that. The amount of attention they're paying to that and actively enacting policies to be able to address that, I think the picture is mixed.
Okay. I'm trying to make sure. Do we have another question? Okay. I will like to ask our speaker to give us more clarity about Chinese loans in Africa, because a lot of propaganda out there term China and China imperialist country.
So I get this question a lot because this is what I do for a living. And here's what I would say. You can't think of the world in a vacuum. Before the Chinese arrived, we were still taking out loans. You remember in 1999, there was a movement called the Jubilee Movement. And the Jubilee Movement was sort of using the biblical principle that in 50 years, you have to waive the debt and forgive the debt. A lot of African countries, I think up to 2/3 of the countries that benefited from debt waivers were African countries. Whose debt was that? That wasn't Chinese, right? So long before the Chinese arrived, we used to take debt. But do you remember what the debt was taken for and what happened with the debt? Africa is the only region in the world that lags every other region when it comes to the provision of power and roads. 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity. Since the Chinese arrived, through their financing and construction, they have built over 100,000 kilometers of roads, over 10,000 kilometers of rail, over 100 ports, massive power plants, water filtration plants. All of those infrastructure are really needed by Africans. So, as I noted in my talk, because Africans do not have savings, you have to look externally to find resources. And so we don't have to take money from China. We could take money from the United States, we could take money from Europe, we could take money from the World Bank and the African Development Bank, and that's what African countries do. The last numbers that show 12% of African debt is held by the Chinese, 12%. 35% of African debt is held by the private sector. Why are we focused on the 12 and not the 35? And this is what I say to people again and again. There is a power struggle between the West and China. But I think it's important for us to carve out our own space. Africa has interests that are unique and separate from whatever the Americans and the Europeans want with the Chinese. We need to ensure that our engagement with the Chinese is happening on terms that are acceptable to us, not necessarily the Americans or the Westerners. So what is the issue that I have with the Chinese? Having said that, it is China's insistence on secrecy that is a problem. Because we need to know the extent of debt. We need to know the terms of the debt. There is a court case today in Kenya where two civil society organizations are suing the Kenyan government to make public the terms of over $4 billion that the Kenyan government took from the Chinese to build the rail between Mombasa and Nairobi. And the reason, according to the Kenyan cabinet secretary, the reason the Kenyans have not made those terms public is because they signed an agreement with the Chinese that they wouldn't. And if they were to make the terms public, it would be a breach of the contract they signed with the Chinese. That is an issue. Because most of these loans have tenures for about 25 years, which means that the government in power that secures the loan is not going to be there when the loan is repaid. And that loan is a liability of the Kenyan people. They deserve to know what they give up for that loan and what interest they're paying and what the terms of that loans are. So I think that's one of the main issues that I have. The second issue that I have with China is also that China is such a massive player and China claims not to interfere in domestic politics. I think that's a good thing. But you need to understand, that when you see a government in a country, that government is a reflection of a domestic struggle. That struggle might be violent through an overthrow, or that struggle might be peaceful through an election. But when you see a government in power, they came to power through some kind of struggle. So when you show up in a country and provide resources to that government, you have picked a side in the struggle that the country is. There is no way a big actor enters into a country and claims like, no, I'm not getting involved in it. I think public financial management, what we do with the money we borrow, how that money is used, how the projects are done, the quality of the projects, all of those things, China has to take responsibility for that. So when it comes to China is imperialist, China is taking over Africa, I'm not sold on that. I think there's a bigger conversation that is happening between the Chinese and the West. That's not our business. That we will focus on developing our country, our continent. We should insist though that in our interaction with the Chinese, the terms of that engagement benefit us and that we're not exploited. That's my view on it.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question. We're going to breakout sessions at 9:30, so that folks would know. And the question that I have in front of me is: African must trade with the wider world, but on whose terms? Does the speaker agree that negotiating investment deals as nation states is a weakness, and that negotiating as a single African government will give Africa greater strength?
Yeah, but that's not going to happen. I think if we look, we're getting closer to that. There's not going to be a single African government. Please, that's not happening. I think we we struggled with the borders that were imposed by colonialists, but over time people have come to accept those borders, and they live within them. People have come to appreciate. I know, look, if we're in Nigeria today, there will be like Hausa Igbo, but once the two Nigerians leave Nigeria, they're attached to the Niger, right? Same thing if we're in Liberia today, it would be like Gribble Crown. But once we leave Liberia, it's LIB. And so I think most African countries are settling into their identity. The idea that they would then combine somehow all of that and have a single government, that's not going to happen. However, they're trying to combine their economies and negotiate as a unit. And the way the AFCTA works is if you're in Africa and you have a factory in Africa, say making toilet paper, you can, if you're in Ghana, you can ship that toilet paper to Nigeria, to South Africa, and Kenya without paying a tariff. But if I have a factory in the United States making toilet paper, and I want to send that toilet paper to Africa, there is an external tariff on that because it is coming from outside the African Union. It's coming from outside the African market. That is going to mean that if I am an American toilet paper manufacturer and I want access to the African market, I have to build my factory in Africa, otherwise I'll be at a disadvantage. That's what this thing is trying to do. When we go to negotiate access to the African market, we're negotiating as a unit instead of small individual pieces. So I agree with you that our prosperity will have to be collective. However, what terms should Africa trade with the rest of the world? I'm African. I'm pro-African, pro-Black, strong, African brother. But I also am aware that international relations is about power. And power determines the terms. All right. For a long time, I would say 1978 up to 1990, 1998, maybe up to 2000, countries could push China around. Then after the global financial crisis in 2008, China sort of emerged from that with these wolf warriors. China just simply refused to be pushed around again. Why? What, the Chinese economy is now close to 15 trillion or so, while the US economy is like 20 trillion. You can't just push China around anymore. So China got respect. China imposed its terms, not through war, but simply increasing its economic power. We have the same population in Africa. If we were to raise our economic power without even going to war, we will be able to dictate the terms of trade. But the combined economies of the entire Africa is still smaller than the German combined GDP of Africa is still smaller than Germany's. Germany has 83 million people. We got 1.2 billion people. And yet our output are equal. There is no strength in that. And so if we want to impose terms on global trade, if we want to dictate the terms at which we engage the rest of the world, it's not going to be through war. It's going to be through increasing our economic power. And my hope is that events like the one we're having today and ones that are happening across the continent will continue to drive us toward that. So that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when we're having this conversation, we would say Africa is now 2 times the size of Germany. Because, what do we call the African giant? What is the largest economy? Nigeria, right? Nigeria has 214 million people. The Nigerian economy is still smaller than the economy of the Washington, D.C. metro area. Right? South Africa and Nigeria are the 2 biggest ones. The Chicago metro area is only about 100 million less than them combined. So when you think of Africa's strength, that strength isn't really a lot. And the path to strength, the path to a more respectable place in the world, the path to be able to dictate and impose terms when we engage others has to be through the economy. And it's going to be a combination of this. We have to invest in the African people. Africa's wealth is not in the ground. Africa's wealth is in its people. It is those people who would take what is in the ground and convert it. And I'm hopeful. In the last 5 years, we've seen at least 9, somewhere between 7 to 9 African unicorns, companies, tech companies that are valued at $1 billion or more. All of those are not a result of extraction. They're knowledge products. The Africans using their brains to create companies that are managing to do that. And that is the path I think we should take. So, Ikemba and Hattie and everyone, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me here today. I enjoyed my time with you, and I hope we find, other opportunities to be able to collaborate in the future.
Oh yeah, definitely. I know we will, and I appreciate you coming, giving such a powerful presentation, and giving a perspective and showing that Africans with different backgrounds can come together and talk about not just the problem but solutions, a way forward. And I'm pretty optimistic that we'll be seeing each other again and working together in some capacity. At least that's my mindset. I look to continue to build. So with that being said, again, appreciate you for being here. Just want to do a little housekeeping for those who are joining us for the first time. I want to welcome you all to this event. This is our 3rd day. This is going to be, for many of us, is already an unforgettable experience, and hopefully this will be an unforgettable experience for you as well. So feel free to move around within the platform. And we carefully selected our speakers with the goal of bringing really thought-provoking, disruptive ideas to the table. There are open sessions. They're live right now. It's 9. So we should have live sessions going on right now. Visit any session you desire. Stick around for the question and answers in the session. Feel free to use the chat in the sessions as well, so you can engage with each other. There's a link where you can access the online program schedule, which is located in the reception area, so you can look to see titles, who's speaking, titles of the presentations, and enter those rooms that you're interested in. If you can't stay the entire time, use the calendar icon located on each session to add events to your personal calendar to remind you when to return to the platform. Be sure and take advantage of the networking opportunities. Click people to locate your friends and family on the platform. You can message them directly or schedule a 3-minute video chat. So all of that can be done on this platform. Visit our expo booths and learn about AUMD member organizations. And lastly, you'll have access to all the recordings after each session is over. You can go back and rewatch these sessions. If you didn't catch it live for up to 30 days, you'll be able to check out those recordings. So, I would advise everybody to take advantage and look at as many of those sessions as possible. Click people to locate. Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. So right now there should be some live sessions going on. You can go into the reception area and see where you want to go. So again, thank you for joining us for our third day of Pan-African Unity or Parish, a call for the abolition of neo-colonialism.